Flight attendant rolled eyes at Black Man's bag. Then he showed. It was his brand-sponsoring Airline. "Excuse me, sir. You're in the priority lane. This is for first-class and elite status passengers only." The security agent's voice cut through the ambient noise of JFK's international terminal loud enough to turn heads. Dominic Reynolds looked up from his phone, his expression neutral despite the familiar sting of assumption. He took a deep breath, his heart rate quickening slightly, not from nervousness but from the practiced calm he had cultivated over years of similar interactions. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his phone. "I am in first class," he replied calmly, sliding his boarding pass across the counter. The agent's eyes widened slightly as she scanned the document, her posture shifting imperceptibly. "Of course, Mr. Reynolds. Have a pleasant flight." Her tone had transformed completely, warmth suddenly infused where suspicion had lived moments before. Dominic nodded and moved forward, shouldering his simple backpack. At 34, he had grown accustomed to these moments, these small daily reminders that his appearance didn't match what people expected from success. Each one left a barely perceptible mark, invisible to others, but forming a pattern he had learned to recognize and navigate with strategic precision. The controlled chaos of JFK's international terminal enveloped him, the percussion of rolling suitcases against terrazzo floors, the symphony of at least 5 languages mingling in the air, the distinctive blend of coffee perfume and the antiseptic undertone that defined all major airports. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, highlighting dust motes in golden beams that fell across harried travelers. He had spent the better part of the last 6 years in terminals, just like this building, his empire, one flight, one meeting, one handshake at a time. Voyager travel gear had begun as a passion project in his Brooklyn apartment, born from his frustration with travel accessories that prioritized flashover function. Now it was a $300 million company that had quietly revolutionized the luxury travel accessory market. Today, Dominic wore a soft, charcoal gray hoodie, tailored black joggers, and a pair of minimalist white sneakers. There was no flashy watch on his wrist, no gaudy jewelry around his neck. He looked more like a graduate student catching a flight home than the founder and CEO of an international brand that had caught the attention of Transglobal Airlines, one of the world's premier carriers. His choice of attire wasn't accidental. Growing up in Baltimore, his father, a high school history teacher with a profound understanding of how the world worked, had taught him an important lesson. Sometimes, son, the most powerful position is to see without being seen. Anonymity had become both shield and lens, allowing him to observe unfiltered human behavior while avoiding the performative deference that wealth often commanded. In the exclusive sapphire lounge of Transglobal Air, he found a quiet corner overlooking the tarmac. Massive jets, their fuselages gleaming under the afternoon sun, were being prepped for their journeys across the globe. The lounge hummed with quiet conversation, ice clinking against crystal, the soft tapping of keyboards. The air smelled of fresh pastries and expensive cologne. He opened his laptop, the screen illuminating his focused, calm features. Behind the composed exterior, his mind worked with precision, turning over contingencies, anticipating challenges, mentally rehearsing his approach to tomorrow's meeting. He wasn't scrolling through social media or watching movies. He was meticulously reviewing the final slides of a presentation titled Voyager X Transglobal Air, a new era of elevated travel. This flight to London wasn't just another business trip. It was the culmination of a year of grueling negotiations. Tomorrow morning, he would be standing in a boardroom with the airline's entire executive committee signing a multi-million-dollar sponsorship deal that would place Voyager's innovative products in the hands of every first and business class passenger. His bag sat next to him. It was the prototype for Voyager's new flagship carry-on, the Odyssey. To an untrained eye, it was just a sleek, matte black suitcase. It had no visible logos, no ostentatious hardware. Its beauty was in its design, the silent glide wheels, the unique polycarbonate shell that was both impossibly light and incredibly durable. The subtle, satisfying click of its magnetic latch. It was the physical embodiment of Dominic's design philosophy. Quiet confidence, undeniable quality. As he absently ran his hand over the Odyssey's smooth surface, memories of its creation flickered through his mind. The countless prototypes, the late-night design sessions, the jubilation when they finally achieved the perfect balance of form and function. This wasn't just a product. It was his vision materialized. A notification pinged on his phone. It was a text from Jordan Phillips, his marketing director. Final presentation approved by design team. All systems go for tomorrow. Knock 'em dead. Dominic smiled slightly. Tomorrow would be more than just a business deal. It would be validation of everything he had built, a testament to the idea that excellence speaks for itself. As the boarding call for Flight TG-112 to London Heathrow echoed through the lounge, Dominic packed his laptop and zipped the Odyssey's front pocket. He slung his simple backpack over his shoulder and walked towards the gate, blending seamlessly into the river of travelers. He was just another face in the crowd, and that was exactly how he wanted it. The priority boarding line was a predictable mix of pinstriped suits and expensive handbags. Dominic took his place, his simple attire earning him a few sideways glances. He ignored them. He'd grown accustomed to the snap judgments, the silent assessments based on the color of his skin and the casualness of his clothes. He'd learned long ago that reacting to them was a waste of energy. The only validation that mattered was the one he wrote for himself in boardrooms and on balance sheets. A memory surfaced, unbidden, his first major investor meeting 5 years ago. He had worn a suit, then believing it necessary to be taken seriously. The potential investor had still asked him if he was the assistant to the CEO. The sting of that assumption had faded, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing that same investor now regularly cited Voyager as the one that got away. At the gate, a frazzled-looking agent scanned his ticket. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. Dominic nodded and walked down the jet bridge, the anticipation of the long flight settling in. He was in seat 2A, a window seat in the coveted first-class cabin. As he stepped onto the aircraft, he was greeted by the senior flight attendant, a woman with a practiced smile and tired eyes. "Welcome aboard," she said. "Right this way to first class." The scent of new leather and subtle perfume greeted him as he crossed the threshold into the premium cabin, a world deliberately designed to feel apart from the rest of the aircraft, a sanctuary of privilege where even the air seemed different. The first-class cabin of Trans-Global Airlines Flight TG-112 was a study in understated opulence. Soft amber lighting cast a warm glow over the polished surfaces and wide leather-upholstered seats. The space held just 12 privileged passengers, separated from the business class section by a solid partition and heavy curtain. As Dominic stepped into this rarefied atmosphere, he felt rather than saw the subtle shift in energy, that almost imperceptible moment when he was assessed, categorized, and, in the eyes of some, found wanting. He caught the fleeting glances, the momentary confusion in the eyes of those already seated. That familiar question that never needed to be spoken aloud, but hung in the air nonetheless. Does he belong here? The tension in his shoulders, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying, tightened slightly. He found his seat 2A, a spacious pod of leather and polished chrome, nestled against the window. The cabin was already filling with passengers who wore their entitlement like designer fragrances. A distinguished-looking older man in seat 1B. Walter Thompson, according to his luggage tag, barely glanced up from his financial newspaper. His Savile Row suit and monogrammed cufflinks speaking volumes about his status. Walter's hands bore the subtle signs of someone who hadn't worked physically in decades. Manicured nails, soft palms, an expensive watch that probably cost more than many people's cars. Yet there was something in his posture that suggested military background, perhaps decades ago, a straightness to his spine that hadn't relaxed with age. Across the aisle in 2C, a woman in her early 50s settled into her seat with the effortless grace of someone accustomed to first-class travel. Unlike some of the other passengers, she offered Dominic a genuine smile. Her name was Isabella Fernandez, though Dominic wouldn't learn this until later. Her elegantly tailored pantsuit and minimal but expensive jewelry marked her as someone who understood the value of quality over ostentation, a kindred spirit of sorts. "Good evening," she said with a slight accent that hinted at Spanish as her first language. "London for business." "Yes," Dominic replied with a polite nod. "You as well." "Always," she said with a warm laugh that creased the corners of her eyes. "Though after 20 years of making this flight, I've learned to find some pleasure in it too." There was something in her gaze, a sharpness and assessment that felt different from the others. Not judging his belonging, but rather seeing him fully. He would later learn this penetrating observation was a skill honed through decades as a California Superior Court judge, where reading people had been essential to dispensing justice. Their brief exchange was interrupted by the senior flight attendant, Catherine Williams, according to her name tag, who approached with pre-departure beverages. Champagne water or orange juice, she asked, her demeanor professional and warm. "Water, please," Dominic replied. Catherine nodded and handed him a crystal glass. There was something in her manner of practiced neutrality that came from years of observing human behavior at 35,000 feet that suggested she saw beyond superficial judgments. The fine lines around her eyes spoke of experience of having seen the full spectrum of human behavior in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. She moved on to assist other passengers, leaving Dominic to settle into his seat. He slid his backpack under the seat in front of him and prepared to place the Odyssey carry-on in the overhead bin. It was then that he encountered her. She was another flight attendant, her name tag reading Allison Parker. She had sharp features, blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a look of harried impatience. She was busy directing a passenger to put his coat away when her eyes landed on Dominic and his bag. Her lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. The storm was about to break. Dominic lifted the Voyager Odyssey. It was light, perfectly balanced in his hand. He had designed it himself alongside his engineering team to fit the overhead bins of every major international carrier with geometric precision. He knew its dimensions to the millimeter. As he reached up to place it in the bin, he sensed rather than saw Allison Parker's approach. "Excuse me, sir." A sharp voice cut through the cabin's low murmur. It was Allison. She stood with one hand on her hip, an expression of weary authority on her face. Her eyes were fixed not on him, but on his bag. "That won't fit," she stated. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a verdict. Dominic paused the bag held halfway to the bin. A memory flashed through his mind, being 16 years old at a mall in Baltimore, shadowed by a security guard who never quite believed he was just browsing. The familiar heat of indignation rose in his chest, his pulse quickening slightly. He felt his jaw tighten, a muscle working silently along his temple. Being pulled over 3 times in 1 month driving his first luxury car. Being asked if he was in the right meeting room at his first venture capital pitch. Being told by a restaurant host that the establishment was fully booked despite visible empty tables. These moments had built a callus over his pride. They had taught him to breathe through the indignity, to respond with measured precision rather than justified anger. This was just one more moment in an endless series. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm and even despite the turmoil beneath. "That bag," she repeated, gesturing with a flick of her chin. "It's too large for the overhead. It will have to be checked." Walter Thompson glanced up from his newspaper, his eyes moving between the flight attendant and Dominic with vague interest, as if watching a mildly entertaining in-flight show. His expression revealed nothing but his attention had been captured. Isabella Fernandez, however, lowered her book slightly, her gaze sharp and assessing. There was recognition in her eyes, not of Dominic personally, but of the situation playing out before her. She had seen this before, perhaps experienced versions of it herself. Dominic looked at the bag, then back at Allison Parker. "It's a standard international carry-on," he said evenly. "It's designed for these bins. It'll fit just fine." Allison's smile was thin and condescending, never reaching her eyes. "Sir, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know what fits and what doesn't. We can't have oversized items taking up space. I can have it tagged and checked for you." A few passengers nearby had stopped their own settling in to watch the exchange. Dominic could feel their eyes on him. Across the aisle, Isabella Fernandez had now completely abandoned her book, her full attention on the unfolding scene. "I appreciate your experience," Dominic said, his tone still placid, "but I can assure you it will fit if you'll just let me try." He moved to place the bag in the bin, but Allison stepped forward slightly, physically blocking his path. Her perfume, too sweet, too strong, filled his nostrils as she invaded his personal space. "Sir, I'm not going to argue with you. The rules are for everyone's safety and convenience. We need to close the bins and prepare for departure." Though for everyone hung in the air, laden with implication. The subtext was clear. People like you always think the rules don't apply. The cabin had grown quieter, the ambient conversation dimming as more passengers tuned into the confrontation. Dominic felt a bead of sweat form at his temple, not from nervousness, but from the effort of containing his response. Years of similar encounters had taught him that his anger, however justified, would be weaponized against him. A raised voice, a sharp retort, any display of emotion would transform him from victim to aggressor in the eyes of onlookers. Isabella Fernandez set her book down entirely, her eyes narrowing at Allison's tone. Walter Thompson's newspaper lowered slightly, his attention now fully engaged in the drama unfolding in the aisle. Dominic took a slow, deliberate breath. This was a critical moment. A crossroads that would determine not just the next few minutes, but potentially the entire flight experience. He could acquiesce, check his multi-thousand-dollar prototype containing sensitive documents for his biggest-ever business deal, and swallow the humiliation. Or he could stand his ground. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Remember, son, when they expect your anger, show them your intelligence." The words had been spoken after a teenage Dominic came home seething from an encounter with a teacher who had accused him without evidence of cheating on an exam. The years had taught him that backing down only invited more disrespect. Yet exploding in righteous anger, however justified, would only reinforce ugly stereotypes and potentially jeopardize the partnership he'd worked so hard to secure. There was a third path, one that required perfect control and strategic thinking. His heartbeat steadied as he made his decision. He felt the familiar clarity that came with choosing strategy over reaction. With all due respect, he said, his voice dropping slightly but gaining a new firmness. "This bag is my company's design. I personally oversaw its engineering to meet FAA and EASA carry-on regulations. Its dimensions are 22 by 14 by 9 inches. It will fit." He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was an expert defending his creation. But Allison Parker didn't hear expertise. She heard defiance from a man she had already judged and dismissed. And then it happened. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical gesture. It was small, quick, and utterly contemptuous. Allison Parker rolled her eyes, a full, exasperated, "You have got to be kidding me," eye roll, followed by a barely audible sigh. It was a gesture that said, "Oh, your company, right? I'm sure." It was a dismissal of his words, his credibility, and his entire existence in that first-class cabin. The quiet cabin seemed to amplify the insult. It was a nonverbal slap in the face. Isabella Fernandez across the aisle flinched as if she'd been struck herself, her knuckles whitening slightly around her armrest. In that moment, a bond of silent understanding formed between her and Dominic, the recognition of a shared experience. Walter Thompson, in seat 1B, quickly looked down at his phone, suddenly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before him. His posture shifted slightly, a nearly imperceptible straightening that suggested discomfort with what he was witnessing but uncertainty about how or whether to respond. Dominic felt a hot flash of anger rise in his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to indulge in years. His pulse quickened, and for a split second he imagined responding in kind with scorn, with righteous indignation. But he immediately suppressed it. Losing his temper was losing the game. He had to be smarter, colder, more strategic. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, a flat, steely calm replacing his earlier politeness. "Please step aside." His tone gave her pause. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed. For a split second she hesitated, but her professional pride, or perhaps something uglier, had been challenged. She doubled down. "Sir, if you cannot comply with crew instructions, I will have to call the gate agent and the purser," she threatened, her voice rising slightly. A faint flush had appeared on her neck, spreading upward to her cheeks, the physical manifestation of her defensive posture. "Then please do," Dominic replied without missing a beat. "Call them both." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesticulate. He simply stood his ground, the sleek black bag held firmly in his hand. He lowered it slowly and placed it on the floor beside him, a silent declaration that he was not moving, and neither was his bag. The standoff had begun, and Allison Parker had no earthly idea of the war she had just declared. The cabin's atmosphere shifted palpably. The ambient conversations dimmed as more passengers became aware of the confrontation. Allison's jaw tightened as she reached for the cabin phone, her movements stiff with indignation. "Is there a problem here?" The question came from Isabella Fernandez, who had risen slightly in her seat. Her voice was polite but carried an undercurrent of challenge. There was authority in her tone, the same authority that had once silenced courtrooms with a single word. Allison turned sharply. "No problem, ma'am. Just ensuring compliance with our carry-on policy." "The gentleman seems quite confident his bag meets regulations," Isabella observed. Her Spanish accent became slightly more pronounced, as often happened when she felt strong emotion. Perhaps a simple test would resolve the matter more efficiently than an argument. With all due respect, Allison replied, her tone suggesting anything but respect. "We make these determinations, not passengers." Dominic remained still, watching the interaction with calculated detachment. This was no longer just about a bag or a bin. This was about power, respect, and dignity, themes that had shaped his entire life and career. A memory surfaced, his father's voice, quiet but firm, teaching him about navigating spaces that weren't designed with him in mind. "They expect your anger, son. Surprise them with your composure." His father had learned this lesson during the civil rights era, when expressing justified anger could cost a black man his life. The stakes were lower here, but the principle remained the same: control the narrative by controlling your response. The tension in Dominic's neck and shoulders remained, but his breathing was steady, his expression neutral. Years of practice had taught him to hold his emotions in check without suppressing them entirely, to acknowledge them privately while presenting a calculated exterior to the world. Catherine Williams, the senior flight attendant, approached with swift, purposeful steps. Her experienced eyes took in the scene: Dominic standing calmly beside his bag, Allison's rigid posture, the attentive audience of first-class passengers. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. There was a quiet competence about her that stood in stark contrast to Allison's defensive energy. Allison spoke first. "This passenger is refusing to check his oversized bag." There was a note of vindication in her tone. Catherine turned to Dominic, her expression neutral. "Sir, my bag is regulation size," Dominic stated simply. "It was designed specifically to comply with all international carry-on standards. Your colleague is mistaken." Walter Thompson, seemingly unable to resist the unfolding drama, folded his newspaper and watched with undisguised interest. A younger man in 3D leaned forward, phone partially raised, as if considering whether this might be social media worthy. The air in the cabin felt charged, as if everyone were collectively holding their breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve. The tension was a physical presence pressing against Dominic's skin. Catherine looked at the Odyssey, then at the overhead bin, making a quick professional assessment. She ran her hand along the edge of the bin, then glanced at the bag's dimensions. "It does look like it might be tight," she admitted. "But if it fits without forcing it, can stay. If not, we'll have to check it." It was a reasonable compromise, and it instantly diffused some of the tension. It was also everything Allison should have offered in the first place. "Fair enough," Dominic agreed. He lifted the Odyssey once more, feeling the eyes of the entire cabin upon him. This small moment had somehow become a referendum on his place in this exclusive space. With practiced ease, he raised the bag to the bin. The Odyssey slid in with a soft, satisfying whisper of polycarbonate against plastic. It fit perfectly with an inch to spare on either side. He closed the bin door. It latched with a quiet click that seemed to echo in the silent cabin. A heavy silence fell over the front of the cabin. Allison's face, which had been set in a mask of smug certainty, was now a mixture of shock and anger. She had been publicly proven wrong. Her authority, which she had wielded with such arrogance, had been undermined. She shot Dominic a look of pure venom before turning on her heel and stalking off towards the galley, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Her retreating footsteps were unnaturally loud in the hushed cabin. Catherine gave Dominic a small, apologetic smile. "My apologies for the misunderstanding, sir. Enjoy your flight." "Thank you," Dominic said, finally taking his seat. The leather embraced him with cool, expensive comfort, but the tension in his body remained. These interactions, however brief, extracted a toll, a small withdrawal from his emotional reserves that accumulated over time. Across the aisle, Isabella Fernandez caught his eye. She gave him a slow, deliberate nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement of his poise under pressure. There was something else in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, of a shared experience navigating spaces where one's belonging was constantly questioned. He took a deep breath and settled back into the leather seat, allowing himself a moment to process the confrontation. His heart rate gradually returned to normal, but a simmering awareness remained. The initial battle was won, but from the look Allison had given him, the war was far from over. 7 hours of airtime stretched ahead, and he had the distinct feeling that the flight attendant wouldn't let the matter rest. Dominic thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. The initial confrontation was over, but Allison Parker's campaign of microaggressions had just begun. For the next hour, as other passengers boarded, and the aircraft prepared for departure, she treated him with a cold, passive-aggressive hostility that was as insidious as it was unprofessional. When she took drink orders before takeoff, she pointedly skipped Dominic's row, only for Catherine to notice and circle back. "Did you get a chance to order a drink?" "Sir?" Catherine asked, her tone deliberately neutral, but her eyes conveying an unspoken apology. "No, I haven't," Dominic replied. "Water still?" "Please." Catherine nodded and moved toward the galley, where she exchanged a few quiet words with Allison. The latter's shoulders stiffened visibly before she turned to prepare the drinks. Her movements were jerky, betraying the tension vibrating through her body. Dominic observed this interaction through lowered eyelids, pretending to focus on his phone while actually documenting the pattern of behavior unfolding before him. Each slight, each deliberate oversight was being catalogued in his mental dossier. Isabella Fernandez, who had observed this exchange, leaned slightly toward Dominic. "Some people should not work in service industries," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. The corners of her mouth turned up in a knowing half-smile that spoke of shared understanding. Dominic gave a small nod, but offered no further comment. He was mentally calculating his options, processing this situation with the same analytical precision he applied to business problems. There was a principle at stake here, one that transcended a simple dispute over luggage dimensions. The plane pushed back from the gate, the engines rumbling to life. Outside the window, ground crew in fluorescent vests became smaller as the aircraft began its taxi. The safety demonstration played on the screens, and Allison performed the manual demonstrations with mechanical efficiency, her eyes sliding past Dominic as if his seat were empty. Her deliberate avoidance was in many ways more pointed than direct confrontation. Dominic felt each glance that wasn't each deliberate non-acknowledgement. His exterior remained composed, but inside a familiar weariness settled over him. How many times had he experienced this? The deliberate erasure, the silent message that his presence was unwelcome or invalid. Too many to count. Once they reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the first-class meal service began. Catherine took the lead on one side of the aisle while Allison worked the other, Dominic's side. "Would you care to see the menu?" "Sir?" Allison's voice was robotic, her eyes fixed somewhere over his shoulder as if making eye contact might somehow validate his existence. "Yes, thank you," Dominic replied, his tone deliberately cordial. She handed him the leather-bound menu with a slight flick of her wrist, as if she couldn't bear to extend the interaction by even a second. When she returned for his selection, her pen hovered over her notepad with impatient energy. "I'll have the salmon, please. Red or white wine?" The question was clipped almost hostile in its brevity. "Just water is fine." Something flashed in her eyes. Perhaps annoyance that he hadn't provided an opportunity for her to forget his wine choice. Dominic noted that Walter Thompson in 1B received a detailed description of both wine options before making his selection. When she served his meal tray 20 minutes later, it was placed on his table with noticeably more force than necessary, causing the water in his glass to slosh onto the tablecloth. A few drops landed on the sleeve of his hoodie, leaving dark spots on the gray fabric. "Oops," she said flatly, not making eye contact. No napkin was offered to blot the spill. Dominic looked at the water droplets on the gray fabric of his sleeve. They were small, insignificant really, but they represented something much larger. They were evidence of a pattern, a deliberate campaign to make him feel unwelcome in a space she had decided he didn't deserve to occupy. His throat tightened slightly as he reached for his own napkin to dab at the moisture. It wasn't the water that bothered him. It was the intentionality behind the action, the small, deniable act of aggression designed to reinforce his outsider status. While the passengers in front of him were addressed as Mr. Thompson or Ms. Fernandez, he remained Sir, or more often than not, just the recipient of a pointed look. His requests for a coffee refill were met with long delays while Walter Thompson in 1B had his cup topped up twice in the same time frame. When Dominic pressed the call button to request more water, Allison took nearly 10 minutes to respond, only to act as if she'd never seen the illuminated light. With each small slight, each passive-aggressive action, Dominic felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, the justified anger at being treated as less than. But rather than letting it consume him, he channeled it into careful observation. Each incident was a data point, a piece of evidence in the case he was building. Isabella Fernandez watched this unfold with growing indignation. During a moment when Allison was occupied in the galley, she leaned across the aisle. "I've been flying transglobal for 20 years, she said quietly. "This is beyond unprofessional. Would you like me to say something?" Dominic appreciated the offer, the allyship in a moment that could feel isolating. But he had his own strategy in mind. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary," he replied with a small smile. "I'm handling it my way." Dominic observed it all with a chilling sense of detachment. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was a case study. This was exactly the kind of poor customer experience his brand Voyager was designed to counteract. Voyager wasn't just about luggage. It was about the entire travel experience. Seamless, intuitive, respectful. Allison Parker was the living, breathing antithesis of his brand's entire philosophy. He opened his laptop and put on his noise-canceling headphones, a clear signal he was done engaging. The quiet hum of the aircraft's engines faded as the technology isolated him in a bubble of focused silence. He pulled up the presentation for Transglobal Air. He scrolled through the slides filled with images of serene travelers, impeccable service, and beautifully designed products. He looked at the tagline on the final slide. Transglobal Air and Voyager reaching new heights of customer excellence. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He felt a profound sense of weariness settle over him. This deal was supposed to be a triumph, a celebration of his company's success. Instead, this flight was a stark reminder of the battles he still had to fight, the perceptions he still had to overcome. It didn't matter that he had built a $300 million company from the ground up. It didn't matter that he had revolutionized an entire product category. It didn't matter that tomorrow he would be signing a partnership with one of the world's premier airlines. In the eyes of Allison Parker, he was just a black man in a hoodie who didn't belong. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel the full weight of that reality, not to indulge it, but to acknowledge it before setting it aside to focus on what he could control. He took a sip of his now cold coffee and looked out the window at the endless expanse of the deep blue Atlantic stretching to the horizon where it met the darkening sky. 35,000 feet below the world continued its rotation, unaware and unconcerned with the small dramas playing out in this metal tube hurtling through the stratosphere. He knew what he had to do. This was no longer just about a sponsorship deal. It was about accountability. He began to type, opening a new document. He started to log every single slight, every dismissive gesture, every moment of unprofessional conduct. He noted the times, the context, and the witnesses. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, transforming personal indignity into clinical documentation. The water on the sleeve, the delayed coffee refill, the ignored call button, the deliberate use of honorifics for other passengers, but not for him. Each incident isolated could be explained away, dismissed as coincidence or oversight. Together they formed an unmistakable pattern. He was no longer just the CEO of Voyager. He was now Transglobal Air's most important and most invisible quality assurance auditor, and Allison Parker was failing her audit in spectacular fashion. Isabella Fernandez observed him from across the aisle, her eyes thoughtful. She had witnessed everything: the eye roll, the slammed tray, the deliberate oversights. As a retired judge who had spent decades observing human behavior in her courtroom, she recognized the pattern of bias unfolding before her. More importantly, she recognized in Dominic something she had seen in the most effective attorney's strategic patience. He wasn't reacting, he was documenting. He wasn't escalating, he was calculating. She made a decision then, one born from decades of ensuring fair treatment in her courtroom. She would be a witness, one whose credibility could not be easily dismissed. The memory of her own experiences surfaced of being the only woman of color on the bench in her district for nearly a decade, of the subtle and not so subtle ways colleagues and attorneys had questioned her authority and expertise. She had fought those battles in her own way, changing the system from within. In Dominic, she recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood that true change required more than righteous anger. It required strategic action. As the flight continued over the Atlantic, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, creating pools of illumination around those still awake. Most passengers had reclined their seats seeking sleep before their arrival in London. But Dominic Reynolds remained upright, his fingers still moving over his keyboard, building his case with the precision of a prosecutor preparing for trial. As the flight droned on somewhere over the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic, Dominic decided to shift his strategy from passive observation to subtle action. He wasn't going to cause a scene or demand to speak to the captain. His response would be like his product's quiet, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. The overhead reading light cast a pool of illumination around him, while most of the cabin remained in darkness. The ambient sounds of the aircraft, the low hum of engines, the occasional clink of ice in a glass, the soft snoring from a passenger 2 rows ahead created an oddly intimate atmosphere. It was the peculiar limbo of long-haul flights suspended between time zones, neither here nor there. He dimmed his screen and began making small edits to his presentation. He added a new unscripted opening slide. It was blank, save for a single powerful quote from a famous business leader about corporate culture. The way your employees feel is the way your customers will feel. And if your employees don't feel valued, neither will your customers. The words seemed to pulse on the screen, taking on new significance in light of his experience. Dominic had always believed in this principle, had built his company's culture around it. But now he saw how profoundly it applied to Transglobal Air. How the subtle contempt he had experienced from one employee reflected deeper cultural issues that no amount of premium amenities could mask. His mind raced with connections forming between his personal experience and the broader partnership he was about to forge. There was an opportunity here, one that transcended his individual discomfort. A chance to create meaningful change that would benefit countless travelers who faced similar treatment but lacked his platform and leverage. He then switched from the presentation to his email. He drafted a message to his head of marketing, Jordan Phillips. The subject line was Urgent Partnership Angle. The email read, Jordan had an illuminating experience on TG-112. It's highlighted a critical need to pivot our launch narrative. The focus shouldn't just be on the luxury of the products, but on the dignity of the travel experience. We need to frame this partnership as a joint commitment to a new standard of service, one rooted in unconditional respect for every single passenger. Think about taglines like, Dignity is the new luxury, or Travel with respect. Let's brainstorm more when I land. This is important. D. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard for a moment before hitting send. This was a significant pivot, one that would require substantial resources and buy-in from Transglobal. But the more he thought about it, the more right it felt. The email vanished into the ether via the plane's Wi-Fi. It was the first pebble that would start an avalanche. An hour later, Catherine came by on a service check. The cabin was quiet, most passengers sleeping or watching movies on their personal screens. She moved efficiently but quietly through the aisle, checking on those still awake. "Everything all right here, Mr. Reynolds?" she asked, her tone genuinely solicitous. "Everything is fine, thank you, Catherine," he said, making a point to use her name. "You've been wonderful," he then added casually. "I must say I'm really looking forward to our meeting with Thomas Morgan tomorrow. This partnership is going to be transformative for both our brands." He delivered this information not as a boast, but as a casual aside, a strategic revelation of his identity and purpose. He saw a flicker of recognition in Catherine's eyes. Thomas Morgan was the CEO of Transglobal Air. He wasn't some mid-level manager. Mentioning him by his first name was a subtle but clear signal of Dominic's importance. Catherine's professional smile became a little warmer, a little more deferential. "Oh, well, we're all very excited about the new partnership, sir," she said. "We've heard wonderful things from corporate." Her eyes darted briefly toward the galley where Allison was visible restocking a cart. Catherine's expression held a mixture of realization and concern, the dawning understanding that one of her crew had been systematically mistreating a VIP passenger. Allison, who was restocking drink carts nearby, overheard the exchange. Dominic saw her pause for a fraction of a second. He could almost see the gears turning in her head. Thomas Morgan. Partnership. But then he saw her dismiss it with a slight shake of her head. In her mind, the narrative was already written. He was probably some low-level marketing guy trying to sound important. The cognitive dissonance of him being a true VIP was too great for her prejudice to overcome. She returned to her work, her disdain for him unchanged. It was a perfect, unintentional test. Catherine, the consummate professional, adjusted her service level based on new, albeit vague, information. Allison, locked in her biases, dismissed the information because it didn't fit her preconceived notions. Later, as the cabin lights were dimmed for the final hours of the flight, Dominic saw his opportunity for the masterstroke. He pretended to be asleep, his laptop still open on the tray table, angled slightly towards the aisle. The screen was still on the presentation, but he had navigated to the About Voyager page. The slide featured a large, professionally shot photo of himself. It was a picture from a recent Forbes article showing him in his design studio looking confident and visionary. Beneath the photo was his name in bold, elegant font, Dominic Reynolds, founder and CEO. He waited. He knew Allison would have to pass his seat on her final checks of the cabin. It was a piece of bait left dangling in the dim light. His heart rate increased slightly as he heard footsteps approaching. He kept his breathing deep and even, his eyes closed, but his awareness heightened. The cool air from the cabin ventilation system brushed against his face as he waited motionless. 15 minutes later, he heard the soft tread of her shoes on the carpet. He felt her presence beside his seat. He kept his eyes closed, his breathing even. He heard a slight pause, a break in the rhythm of her steps. She had seen it. He could imagine her reaction, the initial glance, the double take, the dawning, sickening wave of horror. The name, Dominic Reynolds, the face in the photo, the title, founder and CEO, the name of the company Voyager, the name of the partnership she'd overheard him discussing with Catherine Voyager ex-Transglobal Air. It all clicked together in her mind like the tumblers of a lock. The bag she had called oversized wasn't just any bag. It was his bag. The man in the hoodie she had dismissed and disrespected wasn't just some passenger. He was the powerful new business partner her own CEO was courting. The person she had treated with utter contempt held the fate of a multi-million-dollar deal, and by extension the company's future and her own career in his hands. He heard a sharp, tiny intake of breath. Then the footsteps resumed much faster this time, retreating towards the safety of the galley. Dominic allowed himself a grim internal satisfaction. He didn't need to see her face. He could feel her panic from 10 feet away. The seeds of revelation had been planted. Now all he had to do was wait for them to bear their bitter fruit upon landing. Isabella Fernandez had been watching this silent chess match unfold from her vantage point across the aisle. She had seen Allison pause by Dominic's seat, had witnessed the moment of recognition, and had observed the flight attendant's hasty retreat. A small smile played at the corner of her mouth. In her years on the bench, she had seen countless moments of reckoning, that split second when someone realized they had grievously misjudged a situation. Allison Parker's moment of truth had just arrived, and Isabella had a front-row seat. The remaining hours of the flight passed in a strange hush. Dominic drifted in and out of actual sleep, conserving his energy for what would undoubtedly be a consequential day ahead. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of Allison conferring urgently with other crew members, her body language tense and defensive. Once he opened his eyes to find Catherine studying him with new interest, as if recalibrating her understanding of who exactly was traveling in seat 2A. The weight of anticipation hung in the air as the aircraft began its gradual descent toward London. The dawn was breaking outside, painting the clouds in hues of pink and gold. Dominic watched the transformation of the sky with a sense of calm purpose. Whatever happened next, he had set events in motion that would reach far beyond this single flight, this single slight. He had transformed a moment of personal indignity into the catalyst for something much more significant. And as the seatbelt sign chimed on signaling their imminent arrival, he closed his laptop with a soft click, the sound oddly final in the quiet cabin. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 was about to begin. The descent into London was smooth. The first rays of the morning sun streaked across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and pink. Inside the cabin of TG-112, the atmosphere was shifting. The usual pre-landing bustle was tinged with a new palpable tension that seemed to emanate directly from the galley. Allison Parker was a changed woman. The haughty, dismissive attitude was gone, replaced by a frantic, almost desperate solicitude. She appeared at Dominic's seat no less than 3 times in the final 45 minutes of the flight. "Mr. Reynolds, can I get you some more coffee?" "A water, perhaps," she asked, her voice several octaves higher than before. A sheen of perspiration had formed on her forehead, and her smile was a pained, stretched thing that didn't come close to her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the coffee pot, betraying her inner turmoil. "No, thank you. I'm fine," Dominic replied, his tone polite but distant. He didn't look up from his book, denying her the opportunity to make eye contact to search his face for forgiveness or understanding. Her panic was a palpable thing radiating from her in waves that Dominic could almost feel physically. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and they both knew it. A few minutes later, she was back. "Mr. Reynolds, would you like me to hang your jacket for you so it doesn't wrinkle before you deplane?" Dominic looked up at her, then his expression neutral but his eyes penetrating. The water stains from earlier had dried on his sleeve, leaving faint marks, a tangible reminder of her earlier contempt. "It's a hoodie," he said flatly. "It doesn't wrinkle. But thank you." Isabella Fernandez watched this exchange with barely concealed satisfaction. There was justice in this moment in seeing the woman who had wielded her authority so contemptuously now reduced to desperate appeasement. Allison's final attempt was the most transparent. As the plane taxied towards the gate, she leaned in conspiratorially, her voice lowered as if they were sharing a secret. "Mr. Reynolds, I do want to sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding at the beginning of the flight about your bag. The new models, they can be so deceiving, and we have such strict regulations. I was just trying to do my job." It was a textbook non-apology, blaming the bag and the rules absolving herself of any personal wrongdoing. She was apologizing for the misunderstanding, not for her behavior, not for the eye roll, not for the 8 hours of sustained disrespect. Dominic finally closed his book and looked at her directly. Her eyes were wide with a desperate pleading hope. He gave her nothing. "I see," was all he said. The 2 words delivered with icy finality were more damning than any tirade. They acknowledged her attempt without accepting it, recognized her panic without alleviating it. He saw her face fall. The forced smile crumbled, replaced by a flicker of raw fear. She scurried away when the fastened seatbelt sign pinged off, retreating to the galley like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Dominic was in no hurry. He slowly gathered his belongings, allowing the other first-class passengers to disembark ahead of him. He saw Isabella Fernandez pause at the end of the aisle. She gave him another look, this one filled with curiosity and anticipation, as if she knew some kind of denouement was at hand. "Safe travels, Mr. Reynolds," she said, extending a business card. "Should you ever need a witness to today's events, my contact information." Dominic accepted the card, noting the embossed seal of the Superior Court of California. "Judge Fernandez," he read. "Thank you. I hope that won't be necessary." She smiled knowingly. "As do I, but in my experience, justice often requires corroboration." The card was heavy, made of premium stock, and the embossed seal caught the light as he slipped it into his wallet. It was a small gesture, but one that carried significant weight, a silent alliance formed in the crucible of shared experience. Dominic finally swung his backpack over his shoulder and retrieved the Voyager Odyssey from the overhead. It slid out as smoothly as it had gone in the action, somehow symbolic of the entire situation. He walked towards the open door where Catherine and Allison were standing, bidding the passengers farewell. "Thank you for flying with us," Catherine said warmly to Dominic. Allison just stood there wringing her hands, her face pale, a stark contrast to the perfect makeup she had worn at the beginning of the flight. Have a good day, Mr. Reynolds," she stammered. Dominic gave a slight nod and stepped out of the aircraft and into the jet bridge. And there waiting for him was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Standing just past the threshold was a man in an impeccably tailored navy suit flanked by 2 assistants. He was tall, with silver hair and an air of unmistakable command. His face broke into a broad, welcoming smile the moment he saw Dominic. "Dominic! There you are!" the man boomed, stepping forward and extending a hand. "Welcome to London, Thomas," Dominic replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Thanks for coming to meet me. Thomas Morgan." EO of Transglobal Airlines clapped Dominic on the shoulder. "Nonsense. For our new star partner, it's the least I could do. I trust the flight was comfortable." The entire exchange took place in plain sight of the aircraft's open door. Allison was still standing there, frozen, her face a mask of utter horror. She saw her airline's CEO, the most powerful man in the company, not just greeting the man she had tormented, but greeting him with the warmth and deference reserved for royalty. She saw them embrace like old friends. She saw the name Dominic and the face from the laptop connect with the name Thomas Morgan, and the reality of the situation crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. She had not just insulted a passenger. She had insulted Thomas Morgan's personal guest. She had insulted the star partner whose face was about to be on every press release. The blood drained from her face. She looked like she was going to be sick. Dominic saw her reaction from the corner of his eye. He felt a momentary flash of satisfaction quickly replaced by something more complex, not pity exactly, but a recognition of the universal truth that actions have consequences often beyond what we can foresee in the moment. He then turned his full attention back to the CEO. He let the moment hang in the air for a beat longer, before speaking, his voice calm and measured. "Thomas," he began, his expression turning serious. "The flight was educational. We need to talk." The carefully chosen word educational, rather than terrible or uncomfortable, was deliberate. It signaled a thoughtful assessment, rather than an emotional reaction, positioning Dominic as a strategic partner, rather than an aggrieved customer. Thomas Morgan's smile faltered, replaced by a look of deep concern. He was a shrewd businessman, and he instantly recognized the shift in Dominic's tone. The word educational was not one you use to describe a pleasant flight. "Educational," Thomas repeated, ushering Dominic towards the main terminal, away from the prying ears of the deplaning passengers and crew, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "What happened? Was there a problem with the seat service?" As they walked, a figure detached itself from the stream of passengers and approached them. It was Isabella Fernandez. "Excuse me, Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. Thomas, recognizing a frequent flyer and high-value customer, immediately gave her his full attention. His eyes registered surprise at the interruption, but also respect for the composed authority Isabella projected. "I'm Isabella Fernandez," she said. "I was seated in 2C. I couldn't help but overhear, and I feel compelled to say something." She looked from Thomas to Dominic. "Mr. Reynolds is being diplomatic. The service he received on this flight, specifically from one of your flight attendants, was not just a problem. It was appalling. I witnessed it from the moment he boarded. It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and frankly tainted with a prejudice that has no place on any airline, let alone in a first-class cabin." Her words carried the weight of her years on the bench, precise, measured, but leaving no room for equivocation. She wasn't simply offering an opinion. She was providing testimony. Thomas Morgan's face hardened. He looked at Dominic, his expression a mixture of apology and fury. "Dominic, I am so sorry. This is unacceptable." Thomas, let's find a quiet place, Dominic said, his voice low. The bustling terminal with its constant announcements and streams of travelers was not the appropriate venue for the conversation that needed to happen. One of Thomas's assistants quickly led them to a small private VIP lounge tucked away near the arrivals hall. The room was tastefully appointed with leather armchairs, a small conference table, and windows overlooking the tarmac. A tray of pastries and a carafe of coffee had been set out, though no one moved to partake. Once inside, with the door closed, Dominic laid out the events of the flight. He did so without emotion or hyperbole. He spoke like an engineer diagnosing a mechanical failure. He started with the confrontation over the bag, described the eye roll in detail, and then systematically listed the microaggressions that followed the skipped drink orders, the brusque service, the condescending tone. With each example, he included the time, any witnesses, and the specific actions taken. It was a prosecutor's case, built with meticulous precision. It wasn't about a bag, Dominic concluded, leaning forward. It was about a presumption. Your crew member, Allison Parker, looked at me, a black man in a hoodie, and saw someone who didn't belong. She decided I was a problem before I'd even spoken a word. Every action she took for the next 8 hours was to reinforce her own bias. His voice remained calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that commanded attention. The room had grown utterly silent, the ambient sounds of the airport beyond the door fading into irrelevance. We're about to sign a partnership built on the promise of an elevated experience. But what I experienced up there was the absolute opposite. It was a demeaning experience. And the most concerning part is that if I were just any other paying customer and not the CEO of your new partner brand, this would have gone completely unreported. It would have just been another person of color made to feel unwelcome. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. Then he looked Thomas directly in the eye, a challenge in his gaze. How many times does that happen on your airline, every single day? The question hung in the air, unanswerable yet demanding a response. Thomas was pale. He ran a hand through his silver hair, his corporate composure completely shattered. He looked at Isabella. It is exactly as he describes. She confirmed, her arms crossed. I found it deeply offensive to witness. That woman, Allison Parker, acted with a kind of smug disdain that was truly shocking. Conversely, Mr. Reynolds here, she said, nodding at Dominic, handled himself with a level of grace and restraint I would not have possessed. The corroboration from another high-status passenger was devastating. It removed any possibility of this being a simple misunderstanding or an isolated incident. It painted a picture of a cultural issue that ran deeper than one flight attendant's behavior. I am mortified, Thomas said, his voice thick with genuine anger. Absolutely mortified. There are no excuses. None. He immediately picked up his phone. Get me James Ramirez, head of in-flight services. Get me Natalie Foster in HR. I want them both on a conference call in 5 minutes. I want the entire crew of TG-112 grounded upon landing pending a full investigation. And I want Flight Attendant Allison Parker escorted to a debriefing with HR and legal the moment she clears customs. She is not to work another flight until I say so. He was decisive, his commands issued like cannon fire. But Dominic held up a hand. Thomas, wait, he said. This isn't just about one flight attendant. Thomas lowered his phone, confused. What do you mean firing her is easy? Dominic explained, leaning forward. His voice took on a new intensity, one born not of anger, but of conviction. It's a quick fix that makes for a good headline, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. It doesn't fix the culture that allowed her to feel so comfortable behaving that way in the first place. She rolled her eyes at me in a cabin full of people because she felt secure in her judgment. She felt empowered to do so. Why? This was the master stroke. Dominic wasn't looking for simple revenge. He was looking for structural change. He was turning a personal insult into a foundational business proposition. Our partnership. Dominic continued, his voice resonating with a new power needs to be about more than just putting my products on your planes. It needs to be a real, demonstrable commitment to changing your service culture from the inside out. We're talking mandatory, top-to-bottom implicit bias training, revised customer service protocols, and a zero-tolerance policy that is actually enforced. We can even use my brand's resources to help design and implement it. We can make that the story. Not airline fires employee after complaint, but airline and partner brand join forces to create the most inclusive and respectful travel experience in the skies. As he spoke, Dominic's entire demeanor transformed. The tired passenger from the overnight flight was gone, replaced by the visionary CEO who had built a company from scratch. His eyes were alight with purpose, his hands gesturing to emphasize key points. This wasn't just damage control, it was opportunity recognition. Thomas Morgan stared at Dominic, a new look of profound respect dawning on his face. He was witnessing something extraordinary. Dominic Reynolds had taken the ugliest part of the human experience and was using it as leverage to build something better. He wasn't just a supplier. He was a true partner. Yes, Thomas said, his voice filled with renewed conviction. Yes, you're absolutely right. That's what we'll do. He looked at his assistant. Get James and Natalie on the line. The agenda has just changed. Isabella Fernandez, who had been quietly observing, nodded with approval. In my courtroom, she said, I always preferred restorative justice to punitive measures when possible. Your approach, Mr. Reynolds, has the potential to create lasting change rather than simply punishing one individual. Exactly, Dominic agreed. And that's ultimately more valuable to your company, to your customers, and to society as a whole. The quiet reckoning was over. The revolution was about to begin. As they exited the VIP lounge to head toward TransGlobal's corporate offices, Dominic caught a glimpse of himself in a reflective surface. The man looking back at him was tired from the overnight flight, still wearing the same gray hoodie that had prompted such disdain from Allison Parker. But there was something in his eyes, a determination, a sense of purpose that transcended the fatigue. He thought of his father, who had taught him that real change rarely came from explosions of outrage, however justified. It came from strategic thinking, from transforming obstacles into opportunities, from using leverage wisely rather than emotionally. Looking at his reflection, he could almost hear his father's voice. That's it, son. That's how you change the game. And as he followed Thomas Morgan toward the waiting car, he knew that's exactly what he was about to do. For Allison Parker, the world tilted on its axis the moment she saw her own CEO greet Dominic Reynolds like a long-lost brother. The 8-hour flight had been a stage for her arrogance. The jet bridge was the gallows for her career. As she watched their retreating figures through the aircraft door, a cold wave of dread washed over her, making her knees weak and her mouth dry. Her mind raced through every interaction with Dominic Reynolds, each one now replaying in horrifying clarity. The eye roll, the skipped service, the water spilled on his sleeve, the ignored call button. Each small act of contempt now loomed as a catastrophic error in judgment. Allison. Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. It was Catherine Williams approaching with concern in her eyes. That man, that passenger in 2A, who is he? Allison managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic Reynolds, Catherine replied, watching her closely. Founder and CEO of Voyager Travel Gear, our new partnership that's being announced tomorrow. You didn't know? No, Allison stopped, unable to complete the thought. How could she explain that she had treated the airline's most important new business partner like an unwelcome intruder, that she had dismissed him, disrespected him deliberately, provided substandard service because of how he looked? Her stomach lurched, and for a moment she thought she might be physically ill. She gripped the edge of the galley counter, her knuckles white. The standard post-flight routine was shattered. Instead of heading home for a well-deserved rest, the entire crew of TG-112 was directed to a sterile, windowless briefing room in the operations center of Heathrow. The mood was grim and confused. Catherine Williams, the purser, shot Allison a look that was a mixture of anger and disappointment. The rest of the crew just looked bewildered. "What's going on?" asked Samantha Davis, a junior flight attendant who had worked the business class cabin. "Why are we being held back?" Before anyone could respond, the door opened and a stern-faced man in a suit whom Allison recognized as James Ramirez, Senior VP from In-Flight Services, entered the room along with Natalie Foster, a woman from Human Resources. The tension in the room immediately ratcheted up several notches. "We have received a serious customer service complaint regarding this flight." Ramirez began, his eyes scanning the room, a very serious one. "As a result, you are all grounded pending a full investigation." A collective gasp went through the room. Being grounded was a mark of shame, a black spot on a flight attendant's record. The VP's eyes then settled on Allison. "Allison Parker, please come with us." Allison felt a cold dread wash over her as she followed the two executives down a long hallway to a smaller, more intimidating office. Inside, another woman was waiting, a lawyer from the airline's legal department. The next 2 hours were a blur of methodical, soul-crushing interrogation. They didn't yell or accuse. They were worse. They were clinical. They had a detailed, minute-by-minute report of the flight. It was as if Dominic Reynolds had been documenting every interaction with scientific precision. "Ms. Parker, can you explain the initial interaction with the passenger in seat 2A regarding his carry-on luggage?" Natalie Foster began. Allison's throat was dry and she had to swallow before speaking. I thought it was too big," she stammered. "I was following procedure." According to the purser's report, the HR woman interjected, reading from a file. The bag fit into the overhead compartment without issue. "Is that correct?" "Yes, but—" "And is it true?" The lawyer cut in, her voice like ice, "that you rolled your eyes at the passenger when he attempted to explain the bag's specifications?" Allison's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a thin film of perspiration form along her hairline. The small, dismissive gesture she had made without thinking now loomed like a capital offense. I was stressed. It was a busy boarding process. The complaint, which has been corroborated by another first-class passenger in seat 2C, states it was a gesture of utter contempt. Would you agree with that characterization, Ms. Parker? The room seemed to shrink around her. She could feel the walls closing in, could hear the blood rushing in her ears. How had something so small, so inconsequential in her mind become the focus of this inquisition? No, of course not. It was a misunderstanding. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She had made assumptions based on Dominic's appearance. She had judged him, categorized him, and treated him accordingly. And now, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, she couldn't even articulate why. They moved on, dissecting every moment of the flight, the skipped drink order, the clatter of the meal tray, the use of "sir" instead of the passenger's name. Each individual incident seemed minor, but woven together, they created an undeniable tapestry of unprofessional and biased behavior. The final question came from Ramirez. "Ms. Parker, were you aware that the passenger in 2A was Mr. Dominic Reynolds, the founder and CEO of Voyager Travel Gear?" "Not at first," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And when did you become aware of his identity?" "Towards the end of the flight. I saw his laptop," she admitted, shame washing over her. "And it was only after this realization that you attempted to apologize for the misunderstanding. Is that correct?" "Yes," she whispered. The word hung in the air, damning her. Her apology hadn't been sincere. It had been an act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to undo the damage once she realized the power of the man she had insulted. The verdict was swift and brutal. She was suspended without pay, effective immediately. Her flight privileges were revoked. She would be required to attend a series of intensive multi-day sensitivity and anti-bias training courses. Upon completion, her case would be reviewed by a disciplinary board that would determine if she could ever be reinstated. Ramirez made it clear that reinstatement was not guaranteed. Transglobal Air has a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior, he said, his voice cold and final. You have not only failed to uphold our standards of service, you have become a liability. You jeopardized a multi-million-dollar partnership and damaged our brand's reputation with your conduct. You are lucky you are not being terminated on the spot. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of her small London apartment as Allison Parker adjusted her uniform in front of the mirror. The navy blue fabric was familiar, but everything else felt different. She clipped the small dignity pin to her lapel, running her finger over its subtle embossed design. Once a symbol of her shame, it had become something else entirely, a daily reminder of her commitment to a new way of being. She studied her reflection, noting the subtle changes. The tight defensive posture had relaxed. The permanently pinched expression had softened. Most importantly, the eyes that looked back at her were different, more open, more aware, less quick to judge. The past year had been the most challenging of her professional life. After her conditional reinstatement, she had spent 6 months working domestic economy routes under the watchful eye of supervisors who knew her story. Every interaction was an opportunity to demonstrate that her transformation was genuine, that the lessons she had learned during her suspension had truly taken root. It hadn't been easy. There were days when the old patterns threatened to resurface when a passenger was difficult or when fatigue set in during a long flight. But each time she felt herself slipping toward impatience or dismissiveness, she would remember the recording of Dominic Reynolds's voice calmly explaining how it felt to be on the receiving end of contempt. The memory was powerful enough to reset her perspective. As she headed out for her shift, she scrolled through the news on her tablet. An article caught her eye. Voyager expands Dignity initiative to hotel industry. The piece detailed how Dominic Reynolds' company had formed new partnerships with several luxury hotel chains, extending the principles of respect-centered service beyond airlines into the broader travel ecosystem. The accompanying photo showed Reynolds speaking at a conference, looking confident and visionary, so different from the man in the hoodie she had so casually dismissed. Still following his career, I.C. observed Catherine Williams, who had been assigned to the same flight. The senior flight attendant had been a reluctant ally during Allison's rehabilitation, initially skeptical, but gradually coming to appreciate her genuine efforts to change. "It's hard not to," Allison admitted, falling into step beside her as they walked through the terminal toward their gate. "Everywhere I look, there he is. The partnership with Transglobal has made Voyager a household name." "And made him a very wealthy man," Catherine added. "Though from what I hear he was already doing quite well before our airline entered the picture." Allison nodded. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man she had treated as unworthy of first-class service had been even then far more successful than she could have imagined. But it wasn't his wealth that haunted her. It was her own blindness, her failure to see the human being beyond his casual attire. "The dignity approach really works, you know," she said after a moment. "Since I've been practicing it consistently, my passenger feedback scores have improved dramatically. And I actually enjoy my job more. It's less adversarial, more," she searched for the right word, "human." Catherine smiled slightly. "It shouldn't have taken a corporate initiative to teach us to treat people with basic respect, but I'm glad it's made a difference for you." As they boarded the aircraft to prepare for their flight, Allison reflected on Catherine's words. The older flight attendant was right. Treating people with dignity shouldn't require special training or corporate mandates. It should be instinctive, fundamental. Yet, in the high-stress, hierarchical environment of air travel, those basic human values had somehow gotten lost. The Dignity Initiative wasn't introducing something new. It was recovering something essential that had been forgotten. The flight itself was routine, a 2-hour hop from Chicago to Atlanta. But Allison approached each interaction with a new awareness, a conscious effort to see each passenger as an individual worthy of respect rather than a seat number to be processed. She made eye contact, listened actively, responded to needs without judgment. Small gestures, perhaps, but they created a completely different atmosphere than the one she had cultivated in the past. An elderly woman in 14C needed extra time to settle in. The old Allison might have shown impatience, might have hovered in a way that communicated hurry up. Today, she simply smiled reassuringly and said, "Take all the time you need. I'm here if you require any assistance." A harried father in 22B was struggling to keep his toddler entertained. The old Allison might have seen only the potential disruption. Today, she noticed his exhaustion and brought him an extra snack and a small activity kit for the child with a quiet. Traveling with little ones can be challenging. You're doing great. Each interaction was an opportunity to practice seeing the full humanity in her passengers, to move beyond snap judgments and categorical thinking to genuine connection. At the end of the day, as she checked into the crew hotel in Atlanta, she found herself thinking about Dominic Reynolds again. She had never had the opportunity to apologize to him directly. The letter she had written during her training had been sent through HR channels, and she had no way of knowing if he had ever actually read it. Part of her hoped he hadn't, that he had moved on from the incident without giving her another thought. But another part wished for the closure that could only come from a direct acknowledgement of her wrongdoing. The next morning, as she was having coffee in the hotel lobby before her return flight, she glanced at the check-in desk and froze. There, gathering his keycard, was a man in a gray hoodie and simple jeans. Even from behind, she recognized him instantly. Dominic Reynolds. Her heart began to race, her palms suddenly damp with nervous perspiration. What were the odds? What should she do? Approach him. Pretend she hadn't seen him. The decision was made for her when he turned and their eyes met across the lobby. There was a moment of recognition, a flicker of surprise on his face. And then, to her astonishment, he began walking toward her. "Ms. Parker," he said, his voice neither warm nor cold, simply neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Mr. Reynolds," she managed to respond, her throat suddenly dry. I'm just on an overnight layover. Atlanta to Chicago this morning." He nodded, and an awkward silence fell between them. The ambient sounds of the hotel lobby, the soft music playing overhead, the distant ding of an elevator, the murmur of other guests seemed to amplify the tension. There was so much to say, yet finding the right words seemed impossible. "I wanted to tell you." She finally began, her voice steadier than she expected, "How deeply sorry I am for how I treated you. Not just on the plane, but the eye roll, the dismissive attitude. It was unprofessional and prejudiced. There's no excuse for it." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate that," he said finally, "though I understand you've already expressed these sentiments in writing." So he had read her letter. The thought both relieved and mortified her. "Yes, I did. But saying it to your face feels different. More important somehow." Another pause. "Then, how has the training been? I understand you were in one of the first cohorts." The question surprised her. It wasn't what she had expected him to ask. It was illuminating, she answered honestly. "Difficult at first. I was resistant. But eventually I began to see patterns in myself I'd never recognized before. Ways I treated people differently based on snap judgments. It's changed how I approach my job, how I approach life, really." He nodded, seeming genuinely interested in her response. "That's the goal. Not punishment, but awareness and growth." "Thank you," she said suddenly. for advocating for me to have a second chance. You didn't have to do that. Most people wouldn't have. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. I believe in the capacity for change, and sometimes the people who resist it most initially become its strongest advocates once they've experienced it themselves. Another hotel guest approached, recognizing Dominic and asking for a photo. As he politely obliged, Allison took the opportunity to gather herself. This brief, unexpected encounter was providing the closure she had craved, a chance to acknowledge her failings directly to the person she had wronged. When Dominic turned back to her, she extended her hand. I won't take any more of your time, Mr. Reynolds. I just want you to know that the lessons I've learned from this experience will stay with me for the rest of my career. And I'm grateful, despite the circumstances, for the opportunity to learn them. He shook her hand firmly. Safe travels, Ms. Parker. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement, a recognition that she had changed, that the person who had rolled her eyes at him in that first-class cabin a year ago was not the same person standing before him now. And perhaps that was enough. As she headed toward the hotel exit to catch the crew shuttle, she touched the dignity pin on her lapel. It had become more than just a symbol of a corporate initiative or a reminder of past mistakes. It represented a personal transformation, a commitment to seeing and honoring the humanity in everyone she encountered, regardless of appearance or first impressions. And for the first time since that fateful flight, she felt not just remorse for what she had done, but genuine pride in who she was becoming. The domestic flight from Atlanta to Chicago was routine, almost mundane after the high-powered discussions of the Singapore summit. Dominic had boarded early, settled into seat 2A, and begun reviewing emails on his tablet. He was only vaguely aware of the crew preparing the cabin around him, his mind still processing the implications of the industry's enthusiastic response to the Dignity Initiative. The familiar sensations of air travel surrounded him, the subtle hum of the ventilation system, the scent of clean upholstery, the muted conversations of boarding passengers. Through the window, ground crews moved efficiently across the tarmac, their fluorescent vests bright against the concrete. A voice broke through his concentration. Good morning, sir. May I offer you a pre-departure beverage? He looked up and the world seemed to stop. Standing beside his seat, perfectly composed in her transglobal uniform, was Allison Parker. It had been over a year since their brief encounter in the Atlanta hotel lobby, and nearly 2 years since the original incident. She looked different, not physically, but in her demeanor. The brittle defensiveness that had characterized her service on that London flight was gone, replaced by a calm professionalism. The dignity pin gleamed on her lapel. Her recognition of him was immediate but controlled. There was a flash of surprise in her eyes, quickly masked by professional courtesy. If he hadn't been looking directly at her, he might have missed it entirely. Good morning, he replied, his voice neutral. Water would be fine, thank you. She nodded and moved to the galley. Dominic watched her go, struck by the surreal symmetry of the situation. Once again, he was in seat 2A. Once again, Allison Parker was serving his cabin. But everything else had changed. When she returned with his water, her hand was steady, her movements precise. Here you are, Mr. Reynolds, she said, placing the crystal glass carefully on his armrest. There was no trembling, no desperate attempt to curry favor, as there had been at the end of that first flight when she had realized who he was. Thank you, Ms. Parker, he replied, using her name deliberately, acknowledging that he remembered her too. A brief silence hung between them, laden with the weight of their shared history. Then she spoke, her voice low enough that only he could hear. I want you to know that I've taken the lessons of the Dignity program to heart. It's changed how I approach my job, how I see the people I serve. I'm grateful for the second chance. Dominic nodded slightly. I'm glad to hear that. And I'm sorry, she added, not just for how I treated you, but for what that treatment represented, a pattern of behavior that affected many passengers who didn't have your platform to address it. It was a more profound apology than the one she had offered in the hotel lobby a year ago. That had been personal. This was universal. She wasn't just acknowledging what she had done to him. She was recognizing the broader impact of her actions on countless travelers who had experienced similar treatment but lacked the power to effect change. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means a great deal." She moved on to serve other passengers, and Dominic returned to his emails, but his focus had shifted. He found himself covertly observing Allison's interactions with other passengers, noting the consistency of her service, regardless of how they were dressed or what they looked like. She had indeed internalized the principles of the program not just as professional requirements, but as personal values. Midway through the flight, during a quiet moment, she approached his seat again. "I hope everything is to your satisfaction, Mr. Reynolds," she said, the standard service phrase carrying a deeper resonance given their history. "It is," he assured her. "You're doing excellent work, Miss Parker." A look of genuine surprise crossed her face, followed by a small but real smile, perhaps the first authentic expression he had seen from her. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." As the flight began its descent into Chicago, Dominic reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them both to this moment. What had begun as a confrontation over a carry-on bag had catalyzed not only organizational change at Transglobal, but personal transformation for Allison Parker. The woman who had rolled her eyes at him in contempt was now embodying the very principles of dignity and respect that he had championed. It was a powerful reminder that true change wasn't just about policies or programs. It was about individual growth, about people recognizing their biases and choosing a different path. The Dignity Initiative had created the structure and incentives for that growth, but Allison herself had done the difficult work of examining her attitudes and changing her behavior. After landing as passengers prepared to deplane, Dominic gathered his belongings and retrieved the Voyager Odyssey from the overhead bin, the same model that had been the catalyst for their original confrontation. As he did so, he caught Allison's eye. She was standing in the galley watching him with a complex expression that seemed to acknowledge the full circle they had traveled. He paused as he reached her position at the aircraft door. "Safe travels, Ms. Parker," he said, echoing his words from their hotel lobby encounter. "And you, Mr. Reynolds," she replied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "Thank you for seeing more in me than I saw in myself that day." It was a striking admission, an acknowledgement that his response to her bias had ultimately been an act of seeing her full humanity, even as she had failed to see his. By advocating for structural change rather than individual punishment, by believing in the possibility of growth rather than seeking retribution, he had demonstrated the very dignity he was now advocating for. As he walked up the jet bridge toward the terminal, Dominic felt a sense of closure. The circle was complete. The incident that had once filled him with quiet fury had been transformed into a catalyst for positive change, not just for one airline or one flight attendant, but potentially for an entire industry. The Odyssey carry-on, once dismissed as too large, was now a symbol of a new approach to travel, one rooted in respect rather than assumptions. Looking out the terminal windows at the aircraft that had brought him to Chicago, Dominic thought about the thousands of passengers who would board Transglobal flights today, tomorrow, next year. Many of them would experience a level of dignity and respect that might have been denied them before the initiative. Most would never know the story behind the change, the confrontation over a bag, the eye roll, the strategic response. But they would feel the difference in how they were treated, in the consistency of service, regardless of appearance or background. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, not personal vindication, not corporate transformation, but the quiet dignity afforded to countless travelers who would never have to experience what he had experienced that day in Seat 2A. The Voyager Odyssey rolled smoothly beside him as he navigated the busy terminal, its wheels silent on the polished floor. A living embodiment of his design philosophy, quiet confidence, undeniable quality. Like dignity itself, not flashy or ostentatious, but essential, foundational, transformative. The Dignity is the new luxury initiative transformed not just trans-global air, but the entire concept of premium travel across the industry. What began as one man's strategic response to prejudice evolved into a movement that redefined how airlines approached service training and customer experience. Dominic Reynolds continued to expand Voyager Travel Gear's influence, using his platform to advocate for dignity as the cornerstone of luxury in all aspects of travel. The company's products, particularly the Odyssey carry-on, became symbols of conscious consumerism, beautiful not just in design, but in the values they represented. For travelers around the world, the legacy of that confrontation in Seat 2A was a more humane, respectful experience, one where dignity wasn't a luxury afforded only to those with the power to demand it, but a fundamental right extended to everyone who stepped aboard an aircraft. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most effective response to prejudice isn't outrage or retribution, but strategic action aimed at creating lasting, meaningful change. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true stories about dignity, respect, and standing up for what's right in ways that create real change. What would you have done in Dominic's position? Let us know in the comments below.